Hi, I'm Nicole. My lesson was done with a second grade class. It's a gen ed class, but in our school, the school that I work in, they put all of the ESL students and ELL students in one classroom on the grade. So this is the L class, but there are 8 L students out of the 32 students in the class. Out of the 32 students, 15 are male. 15 are female, 17 are male. There are 2 students with IEPs, and those students have IEPs due to occupational service needs and speech therapy needs. Those 2 students do require step-by-step instructions. Visual aids are always used in the classroom, especially because of the ESL students as well. So my lesson was on preview and predict. This is something that the students are already a little bit familiar with, but they're struggling with making predictions. That's why this lesson was important to do. And let me show you. So this is the anchor chart that was hanging in front of the classroom. So it says we can make predictions. It says before we read, we look at the picture, we look at the cover, we take a sneak peek, and while we read, stop and make a prediction. Think what would happen next. So this was hanging when I did the lesson. The lesson actually took place about a week and a half ago. So for this lesson, I began by modeling for my students after activating their prior knowledge. How do you take a sneak peek? What do you look for when you take a sneak peek? And then we talked about how another word for sneak peek is the word preview. Because of the language in this class, I always have the vocabulary hanging in front of the classroom before we start a lesson. So I always make sure to front load the vocabulary that will pertain to the lesson. So we talked about how we learned in word study, we use foundations for word study, and we had just done a lesson a few weeks ago on prefixes and suffixes. So we talked about how the prefix pre means before, and we know the word view means to look at something. So preview means before you look at something. We talked about how some students were making connections to the movies and how you see the previews before the movie. So we previewed the book before we read it, which is another word for sneak peek. So this was the model text. It's called But I Want It. And this is a book that I actually sat in my small group. We did a guided reading small group for this lesson. And I sat with struggling readers, students who are reading significantly below grade level at this point in the year. So for this book, I read the title to the students. I asked them to look at the picture, and we took a sneak peek through the book looking at all of the pictures. And I modeled thinking aloud what was happening. So for instance, I was looking through the pictures and I said, okay, I see that there is a baby worm here with this angry bird. There's a little baby worm. He doesn't look very happy. This character looks like another worm. I told students, I think that this might be the mother worm. She doesn't look very happy either. I continued to model that this is what I would guess is to be the father worm. And I told students how I use my prior knowledge. Well, I know that this worm is bigger than the little baby. You could see the little baby standing next to him. So I said, I know that because he's bigger, something I already know, I think that he must be the father. And then when I got to this page, I showed students that I'm, again, thinking aloud. Well, I see that the baby's in the bed, and it looks like something serious is happening. I can tell by their faces, and so on and so forth. So after I previewed the book, I modeled making a prediction. I modeled using the language. I predict this book will be about blank because blank, and I always show them using the title. So for instance, I think But I Want It will be all about blank because, and then I give my reason. So I modeled that for students, and I had chart paper hanging with an enlarged version of the graphic organizer students were given for the activity portion of the lesson. So I modeled filling it in and having the replica in front of the classroom, which I could have also done it on the exact graphic organizer and had it on the smartboard in the classroom. It's another way to do it. But on the smartboard, I had academic language, the vocabulary, for the students to see. But yeah, so having the bigger model is especially important when you have students like L students and my 2 IEP students who often struggle with what is expected of them when they return to their seats. You need to have the exact model. So having that same graphic organizer just enlarged helped them to see and to visualize it. After that, I read the first few pages of the book to the students aloud, and I stopped at a page that had this bookmark. It says, stop, make a prediction. And again, you can see the use of visual aids, very important for this group of students. And I showed students, sometimes we write on Post-its in our book, so I showed them writing on a Post-it. And I made my prediction using now what I thought was going to happen before I read, what I know I saw in the pictures, using the title, very important connection, and then also what I read so far. So I told students, I'm going to write my prediction. This is what you're going to do when you get to the bookmark in your book, which I'll explain in a minute. I predict that little worm will be mad and cry. So I made my prediction. I wanted to model for students without saying why, and then I modeled also with saying why. So I predict that little worm will be mad and cry. Some students, I knew that was going to be all that they were able to do at this time, and that was fine. I also modeled if you wanted a challenge. I predict that little worm will be mad and cry because his father said no, and he wants to get everything that he wants. Okay, so that was that. So what I did next was I told students, when you return to your seats, some of you are going to be getting this book, Frog and Toad Are Friends. Now, we're very familiar with the Frog and Toad series, so I reminded students, when you take your preview or your sneak peek, I want you to think about what you already know about these two characters. So use your prior knowledge. Use what you already know about Frog and Toad, what kind of characters they are, to make your prediction. In this book, there's chapters, but each chapter is a story, in case you're not familiar with the Frog and Toad series. So I gave students a chapter, for instance, a lost button, and I assigned them this chapter, and I told them, you're going to look at the pictures and take a sneak peek only in your chapter. This way, they, because the other chapters are not related. They're isolated small stories, and they're already, like I said, familiar with these books. So they're looking at the pictures. They go back to the beginning of the chapter. They'll stop and make their initial prediction on their graphic organizer. The graphic organizer said, I can make predictions during reading. It said I can make predictions, and on one side it said before reading, and on the other side during reading. And some of the students were given sentence starters if needed. So for these students, then what they would do is they would make their initial prediction, what they think the chapter is going to be about, and why, if they can explain why. And then I had already placed the bookmark a few pages in. Since this was the initial lesson with writing down our predictions like this, I wanted students to know and have that guidance of where to stop. Because the next step is going to be going into their independent reading books over the next few days, which this lesson took place last week, so we already started this. So now when they go into their independent reading books, they're going to carry this over on their own, and they have been writing predictions while reading. And but because this was the first lesson where we were actually writing predictions, before this we had only done turn and talks with predictions and shares, and I wanted them to have the reminder. So while those students were doing this at their seats, what they were supposed to do was, just like I modeled, they were supposed to go to the chapter. They were supposed to read the title, take a sneak peek, make a prediction. Then begin reading, stop at the bookmark, make another prediction, and write it down. For the students who are the struggling readers who are not reading at the grade level standards yet, I told them today they weren't going to do their initial prediction because we're going to use the same book. For guided reading, students are always given the same text and sitting in a small group. So I had multiple copies of But I Want It with the bookmarks in place. And we talked about what we already read. We reread the prediction that we made as a class that I elicited from students to get their ideas. Did they agree with my prediction? Did they disagree? And I wanted them to explain why using that language. And then after that, we continued reading, and I had another bookmark placed a few pages later so that we can stop again and make a prediction. Again, this was just to get the students to practice using this new way of thinking and to get the skill and to understand what a prediction was, and to also really focus on the text, what was happening in this text. So we sat as a guided group. We finished reading the book. And then the students made, we read a few more pages, the students made their predictions, and then I had told them if time permits, we'll finish reading, and we were able to do so. Another lesson that I was intending to do, which we did before they went into their independent reading books the next day, I told them, make sure you finish this. So like my guided group had already finished this. I wanted them to go back and reread, looking at their prediction, and I wanted them to check, was your prediction correct? Why or why not? Because this really is all about the students' comprehension. Are they understanding what they're reading? Are they really making a logical prediction? So I gave them a self-evaluation tool. It was, I have a small example of it. It was here it is. Looks like this. It was 3 smiley faces. It was 3 faces, a smile, a middle face, and a sad face. And the faces said right, almost right, or incorrect. And what I wanted students to do was explain. This is an example one student did. She had worked in a small group with me, and she chose. So she said, I think my prediction was almost right, because Little Worm did not get the ice cream or the new Superworm movie. So she had to look back to her prediction and assess herself. This was a tool that I wanted them to use just to be able to hold them accountable. And my observation notes while students were working, I mostly took observation notes on the students in the guided group. But moving forward, and we're actually still working with this, probably for this next week, since we have 1 week until spring break, so this week we'll still focus on this while reading. I explain to the students, because we are a TC school, so I tell them they have all of the good reading skills. So I tell them, good readers take all of their skills and their tools, they keep them in their toolbox, and they're able to apply them as they keep reading. So and now that their students are reading books like this, the full book, by the end of 2nd grade, they're reading chapter books, even longer than this, some of my students. They need these skills to help them to become stronger readers. So making predictions is to help you make sure you're focusing on what you've read so far, what you already know, what do you think is going to happen, and why. Thank you.